My daughter emptied my account before my birthday. I only found out when my card declined at the pharmacy. But I wasn't confused. I was calculating. The young clerk looked at me with pity as if I had lost my mind, but I knew exactly what had happened. That same afternoon, my phone lit up with her post. A photo of me beside a cake I hadn't even cut. Her caption screaming louder than candles ever could, still not dead, with a row of laughing faces. People thought it was a joke. They pressed hearts, typed laughter, cheered her for being witty. I read each one like a nail hammered in. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply closed the phone and sat in my chair, the hum of the fridge filling the silence. I thought of the pills I'd paid for with the last folded bills in my pocket. The way I had smiled at the clerk, so no one would see my pulse racing. I thought of my daughter's lip gloss, the one she always wore when she kissed my cheek, cold and sweet, while her hands were already reaching for my purse. I remembered how she had asked for my passwords just in case, how she said it so softly it sounded like love. Now the truth was spread out in front of me, bare and sharp as glass, and I felt no confusion, only a kind of stillness. They thought they had buried me under shame, under silence, under the weight of being old and dependent. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. I was born into a small house where the wind slipped through the walls in winter and the summers burned so hot the tin roof sang. My father worked with his hands until they were cracked, and my mother stretched one loaf of bread into meals for days. We didn't have much, but we had pride. I learned early how to sweep floors until they shone, how to boil potatoes 3 different ways, and how to stitch a torn sleeve so the patch held stronger than the cloth. As a girl, I dreamed not of riches but of steadiness, of a home where no one had to hide hunger and where birthdays meant cake that wasn't made from scraps. I thought if I gave enough, worked enough, loved enough, the world would soften. When I married, it wasn't a grand wedding, just a borrowed dress, some wildflowers picked at dawn, and a promise that we would build something better. I worked. I cleaned. I fed them before I fed myself. I stretched every paycheck the way my mother stretched that loaf, but I never let my children feel poor. If there was one piece of meat, it went on their plates. If there was one warm coat, it went on their backs. I learned to go without, quietly, and to smile so they never carried the weight I was carrying. Motherhood became my measure of worth. I saved every drawing, every card, every silly craft from school. I made birthdays into holidays, Christmas into magic. Even when my husband's temper wore me down and the nights felt long, I clung to the sound of my children laughing. That was my gold, my treasure chest. I sewed costumes, baked bread, and stayed awake with sick fevers while the rest of the world slept. I did not count the hours. I did not keep score. I only whispered to myself, they will know. They will remember. Later, when I became a grandmother, my hands softened again. I thought, here's my second chance at joy. I let the little ones climb over me, pulled cookies from the oven just as they walked in, and saved coins in a jar for surprise trips to the toy store. I made quilts with their names stitched in the corners, so they would know they were wrapped in love, even when I wasn't near. My hope was simple, that the love I poured in would return someday, maybe not as much, maybe not the same, but enough to remind me that I mattered. I never asked for luxuries. I didn't need vacations or jewels or grand houses. My dream was a seat at the table, a phone call on Sundays, a hand reaching for mine when the years grew heavy. Dignity, that was all. A place in their hearts after giving them my bones, my sleep, my youth. I thought family was an unbreakable rope. I thought all the small sacrifices were weaving something strong. But now, sitting here with my account emptied and my name treated like a punchline, I see the rope unraveling. I gave and gave until there was nothing left to give. And instead of gratitude, they turned cold. The same hands I once held now push me aside. The voices that once called for me now call for what I own. I worked. I cleaned. I fed them before I fed myself. And now, when I need only respect, only kindness, I am met with silence, with betrayal, with laughter at my expense. They call it aging. I call it erasing. And that is what cuts the deepest knot, that I lost money. Not that I lost things, but that the years of sacrifice feel like they never existed at all. It started small, the kind of changes you almost convince yourself you imagined. The phone rang less often, and when it did, the voices on the other end felt distracted, rushed, as though they were checking me off a list. "Hi, Mom, just making sure you're alive," they'd laugh, and though I smiled at the sound, something about the word stung. When I asked how they were, the answers grew shorter. They used to tell me everything, their worries, their joys, their troubles at work. Now they said, busy, fine, tired, and quickly changed the subject. I told myself it was life, that everyone gets busy. I told myself not to take it to heart. Then came the compliments that weren't really compliments. "You're doing so well for your age," they'd say, looking at me the way people look at a house they don't think will stand another storm. "You remembered that?" they'd ask, laughing softly, as though remembering were a miracle for me. I chuckled along, but the laughter caught in my throat when I was alone. They began to speak slower, louder, as if my ears and my mind had gone weak together. "You don't need to worry about that, Mom," they'd say. "We'll handle it." And I wanted to believe it was care. I wanted to believe it was love. Questions followed, innocent enough on the surface. "Do you have your will set up?" one asked over coffee, her voice casual but her eyes sharp. "You've told me the bank password before, right? Just in case something happens." I brushed it off, told them I'd write things down and keep it safe. They pushed a little harder, reminding me how fragile life is, how quickly things can change. One of them even opened my pill bottles, counted the tablets, and reminded me I should label them better so no one gets confused. I laughed then, and said I was still capable of knowing one pill from another. Still, when they left, I noticed the bottles weren't where I'd placed them. I kept offending them, even in my own mind. I said to myself, they're worried, that's all. I said, they just want to be prepared. I told friends who asked that my children were attentive, that I was lucky. When a neighbor raised an eyebrow after seeing my daughter leave with a stack of papers, I shrugged and said, "Oh, she helps me with bills." I'm not as fast as I used to be. I kept layering excuses like blankets over a truth I didn't want to see. But blankets only cover so much. Underneath, the chill grows stronger. There were nights I lay awake, the words echoing, "You're doing so well for your age." I began to notice the pauses after I spoke, the way their eyes slid to one another like they were having silent conversations I wasn't invited to. I noticed how their hugs were shorter, their hands lighter, like I might crumble if they touched me too long. And I noticed how often money came up, always slipped in carefully. "Are you comfortable? Do you have enough put away?" You know, nursing homes can be expensive. The more I replayed it all, the more the threads connected. It wasn't just care. It wasn't just a concern. It was a quiet measuring, a calculation happening in the background of every conversation. I still wanted to believe the best of them. I still told myself, they love you, they mean well, but the words grew hollow even in my own mouth. Because love does not ask for passwords more than it asks about your heart. Love does not laugh at your memory when it once depended on it. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to stay blind, to hold on to the image of children who cherished me. But the silence between calls, the coldness behind their eyes, the questions that circled like vultures, they began to pile higher than my excuses. And deep down, I felt it in my chest, in that place where mothers always know something was coming, something I would not like. It happened on an afternoon that began like any other. My daughter came by with a smile so wide it almost convinced me. She brought flowers, cheap ones, their stems already soft with rot, and she placed them on my table like it was a holiday. "We're taking you for a little ride," she said, as if it were a gift. I put on my coat, thinking maybe it was lunch, maybe a trip to the park. I didn't ask questions. I trusted because that's what mothers do. But when the car stopped, I didn't see a restaurant or a park bench. I saw a building with locked doors and windows that didn't open. A place that smelled like bleach and boiled cabbage. She held my arm as we walked in, her grip gentle but firm, the way people hold something fragile they're afraid will slip. She signed papers while I stood by, and every pen stroke sounded like a nail in the coffin of my independence. When I asked what this was, she said it was temporary. "Just until things settle," she assured me. "Settle what?" I wanted to ask. but the words never made it past my lips. A woman in a uniform appeared and smiled the way people smile when they aren't really looking at you. She led me down a hall with 2 bright lights and rooms that all looked the same until we reached one with a bed made too neatly, no wrinkles, no history. She gestured inside. My daughter kissed my cheek, her lip gloss cold as always, and whispered, "You'll thank me later." Then she was gone. I sat on the edge of that bed, staring at the walls stripped of photographs, of color, of anything that said I belonged. When I asked about my things, the staff told me they would be brought later. Later never came. My clothes were gone. My drawers at home emptied. My bank card declined when I tried to order something small from the cafeteria. Accounts frozen. Passwords changed. Phone calls filtered through schedules. Even my mail arrived opened, resealed with tape that wasn't mine. The staff spoke to me like I was already fading. "Sweetheart, time for dinner," they said, as though I were a child. "No worries, we'll handle it," when I asked about bills. I wanted to shout to remind them I had run a household, raised children, worked jobs with aching feet and sleepless nights. But the word stayed trapped in my chest, heavy as stone. The more I insisted I was fine, the more they nodded and smiled, the way you do at someone you've already decided not to believe. Every night I lay in that narrow bed, my body stiff against the sheets that smelled of bleach, and I realized piece by piece what had been taken. The bed wasn't mine. The room wasn't mine. Not even the tears were mine anymore. They soaked into sheets that belonged to someone else, sheets washed and folded by hands that didn't know my name. The humiliation was sharp, colder than any winter. To be treated like a burden, like a shadow of myself, after all the years I had carried them. I watched my daughter's smiling face in my memory, the way she signed those papers as if she were doing me a kindness, and I felt something inside me fracture. Not confusion, not even grief, just a stillness, deep and hard. They thought they had taken everything, my home, my money, my freedom. They thought I was paralyzed, finished, erased. But as I lay in that unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling that held no story of mine, I made a quiet vow. This was not the end. The nights were the hardest, but also the clearest. In the stillness, when the halls quieted and the shuffle of shoes faded, I found my strength again. They thought the locked doors and the clipped voices of the staff had silenced me, but I still had my hands, and they still knew how to write. I asked for paper under the excuse of wanting to pass the time, and they brought me a thin pad with a dull pencil, like they were humoring a child. They didn't know what I could do with those small tools. They didn't know that a life of running households, paying bills, signing forms, and balancing scraps into meals had trained me to keep track of everything. Numbers, names, dates they lived in my head, and I poured them onto the page before they could fade. I wrote down account numbers I remembered by heart, phone numbers of people who once owed me favors, the name of the lawyer who helped with the deed on the house, even the birthdays of clerks at the bank who had always been kind to me. Every scrap of detail mattered. Every small thread could be pulled. I wrote slowly, steadily, not rushing, not wasting. Each line gave me a little more breath back, a little more space in that narrow room. I wasn't screaming. I was writing. In the mornings, the staff tried to coax me into activities, puzzles, music, exercise classes with soft chairs, but I nodded politely and returned to my pad. I wasn't idle. I wasn't broken. I was gathering, weaving, and planning. I remembered the way my daughter had signed those papers with a flourish, the way her voice turned gentle when she said it was for my own good. I replayed every word, every gesture, until it formed a map of her intentions. People underestimate old women. They forget we remember. They forget that silence isn't weakness. It's storage. As the days blurred together, I became sharper. While they saw me sitting quietly in that stiff chair by the window, I was planting rows in my mind, seeds of strategy that would sprout when the time was right. They thought they had buried me. I was planting something. Each note I scribbled was a root. Each memory I captured was water. I was not done. I began to write letters, not to send, but to remind myself of my voice. Letters to the bank. Letters to the lawyer. Letters even to my daughter, though she would never see them. In those letters, I laid out the truth, cold and factual, stripped of begging. I listed what had been taken, how it had been done, who had smiled while it happened. No trembling in my words, no fear. Just evidence, neat and undeniable. At night I hid the pages under my pillow, folded flat against the thin mattress. I knew they might search my drawers, but I also knew the staff had too many others to watch. No one believed an old woman with thinning hair and shaky steps could still be a threat. That was their mistake. That was my shield. The humiliation that had once burned like fire cooled into something harder, steadier. I didn't think about revenge in the loud, angry way of youth. I thought about justice in the quiet, certain way of someone who has lived long enough to know that patience is its own weapon. My children thought they had ended my story, but I knew better. They had only given me a new beginning, one I would write with my own hand. So I sharpened my pencil against the edge of the table, smoothed the paper with the side of my palm, and kept going. Day after day, line after line, until the silence of that place was no longer suffocating, but useful. They thought they had stripped me of everything, but they forgot the one thing I still carried, the thing they couldn't touch, my memory, my mind, and the will to use both. The first step came quietly, almost invisible to anyone watching. I had written enough letters in my mind to know which one mattered most, and I put it on paper with a steady hand. To the lawyer I remembered from years ago, the one who helped with the deed to my house, I wrote every detail, names, dates, numbers, signatures I never gave, the way my account had been emptied before my birthday. I folded it carefully, slipped it into an envelope addressed by memory, and waited for the right moment. When the staff offered to post my family letters, I smiled, thanked them, and tucked mine into the pile. They didn't look twice. That was their mistake. Weeks later, when the shuffle of routines made each day feel like the last, he arrived. A tall man, older now but still with sharp eyes, walked into the common room and asked for me by name. The staff looked surprised but allowed it after all. A lawyer's visit carries weight even in places where residents are treated like children. He sat across from me at the small table, lowered his voice, and said, "I got your letter." My hands trembled only once, then grew steady again. I told him everything, not as a desperate plea, not as a confused ramble, but as a clear recounting, line by line, fact by fact. He listened, nodding, and when I finished, he said, "We'll start immediately." The test came next, arranged quietly, without my children knowing. A doctor asked me questions, gave me small tasks, and waited for me to falter. I didn't. I recited numbers, balanced sums, recalled dates and names, even gave him the recipe for bread I'd made for 40 years, step by step. At the end, he smiled, not a patronizing smile, but a real one. "You're sharp," he said. "Sharper than most people half your age." The report reflected that. Competent, independent, in full control. The very words my children had tried to erase. Then came the papers, the motions filed in court. Fraud, financial exploitation, guardianship revoked. My daughter was served, her smile finally forced to break. I wasn't there to see it, but I imagined the look on her face when the lawyer explained she no longer held control, that her clever signatures and sly withdrawals had not gone unnoticed. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself a quiet laugh. Not cruel, not loud. Just the sound of relief that justice had found its way back to me. When the day came, I didn't pack much. Just a small bag with a few clothes, the pad of notes I had written, and the pencil worn down to half its length. I didn't need anything else. The staff opened the door not because my daughter had given permission, but because the law now stood at my side. I walked down the hall steady, head lifted, past rooms that had once felt like a cage. The same halls that had stolen my dignity now echoed with the sound of my own footsteps carrying me out. Outside, the air tasted new. Not sweeter, not younger, just mine again. I didn't look back. There was nothing left in those walls that belonged to me. Everything that mattered walked out with me. My freedom, my proof, my name. My children thought they had stripped me down to nothing. But in truth, they had only given me the chance to rebuild on my own terms. I walked out with a bag of clothes and more power than I'd ever had. The silence after my return was almost sweeter than freedom itself. I didn't announce it, didn't call them to gloat or demand apologies. I simply went home to what was left of my life, stood in the middle of the empty rooms, and let the truth settle around me. The house still had my walls, but it no longer held my trust. Every drawer had been rifled through, every paper turned over, every memory measured for its value. It wasn't a home anymore. It was just a structure, and structures can be sold. So I did, quietly, without warning. I called the realtor myself, signed the papers myself, and told no one until the deal was already sealed. There was no discussion, no family meeting, no tears over memories. I had poured enough of my life into keeping that roof over heads that weren't mine. Now I was reclaiming it for myself. The day I handed over the keys, I felt lighter than I had in years. It wasn't sadness that followed, it was relief. When the news finally reached them, the panic was instant. Calls began flooding in, one after another. "Mom, what have you done? You should have told us first." That house was supposed to stay in the family. Supposed to. Always supposed to, as if my life, my work, my sacrifice belonged to them by default. I let the phone ring. I let the messages pile up. Their voices grew more frantic with every hour, but I didn't feel shaken. I felt steady. They tried guilt. "Dad built that house with you. Don't you care?" They tried shame. "What will people think when they hear you sold it without us?" They tried fear. "Where will you go? How will you manage?" I listened to their words the way one listens to a storm beating at the window, loud, insistent, but unable to touch me as long as I stayed inside. The money was mine. For once, it was mine entirely, without strings or conditions. I didn't spend it lavishly. I didn't run off on wild adventures. I placed it where it would be safe, where their hands could never reach. I kept a small part for comfort, the rest for the future I still had. They thought I was too old to make choices, too weak to stand on my own. Selling that house was my answer, written in deeds and signatures they could never erase. They came knocking, of course, faces red, voices raised, pounding on my door like they could shake the decision out of me. But I had already learned the power of silence. I didn't open it. I didn't explain. I didn't soothe them like I had all my life. I simply turned off the porch light and let them stand in the dark. For the first time, I wasn't the one outside begging to be seen. I was the one inside holding my ground. They thought they had cornered me, thought I would never step outside their grasp. But I had slipped free, and I didn't owe them a single word. My revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't messy. It was clean, simple, and final. They came knocking. I turned off the porch light. The phone never stopped ringing. First came the angry calls, sharp and demanding, full of questions they thought I owed them answers to. I let it ring until the sound became nothing more than background noise, like a leaky faucet I refused to fix. Then came the softer voices, apologies wrapped in honey. Words like, "We didn't mean it that way," and "You know we love you." Love doesn't drain bank accounts. Love doesn't lock doors. Their voices carry desperation, not care. I listened to the machine record their messages, and then pressed delete without hesitation. Soon gifts began to arrive. Bouquets left on the porch, chocolates I didn't touch, sweaters folded neatly in boxes with tags still on. I looked at them the way one looks at props on a stage, pretty, but meaningless. They thought they could buy back what they had taken, thought flowers could cover the scent of betrayal. I let the petals wilt in their vases, the chocolates harden in their wrappers. Nothing they sent could undo what they had done. Then the criticism arrived, not from them but from the others. Cousins, siblings, old friends who had only heard one side of the story. "You shouldn't be so cold," they said. "They're still your children." I nodded, smiled politely, and said nothing. Because they didn't know the hours I spent in that room without my name. The nights I counted pennies because my account had been emptied, the weight of humiliation pressed onto my shoulders by the people I had raised. They didn't know how deep the cut went. They couldn't. And I had no energy left to explain. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't vengeful. I was simply done. I had lived too many years feeding others first, carrying the blame, softening every blow. Peace was the only thing I wanted now, and peace has no space for guilt. I chose my quiet mornings, my slow walks, my tea steeped just the way I liked. I chose books I had put off for years and meals that belonged only to me. I chose the sound of my own voice in the silence, steady and unshaken. People asked me if I would ever forgive. I said forgiveness is an ode. It isn't a prize they get for remembering me after stripping me bare. I gave enough already, more than enough. My youth, my body, my home, my trust. There was nothing left to give, and I wasn't going to dig into the hollow space they had left inside me just to hand them more. So I let the phone ring. I let the gifts pile. I let the whispers about me travel from mouth to mouth. And I sat in my chair by the window, watching the light change on the walls, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. Not the freedom of youth, but the freedom of release. The freedom of no longer waiting for apologies that would never mean anything. The freedom of closing a door and knowing it did not have to open again. Forgiveness is an ode, and I gave enough already. For so long, I believed what they wanted me to believe, that I was heavy, a burden, a problem to be managed instead of a person to be cherished. I carried that weight like an invisible stone on my back, convincing myself that my worth had already expired. But once the noise faded, once the calls stopped matching and the door stayed closed, I began to hear something softer. My own voice, steady and still alive inside me. It surprised me at first, like finding an old song you had forgotten the words to. I wasn't the burden. I never had been. I began to reclaim the small things that had always been mine. My table, once crowded with others' plates and their laughter, became my own again. I set it carefully, not for a crowd, but for one. A single plate. A cup of tea is steaming beside it. Food made only to please my taste, not stretched to feed mouths that never thanked me. The chair creaked beneath me as it always had, but it sounded different now, like it was sighing with relief, no longer forced to hold the weight of everyone else's needs. I bought flowers, not because anyone was coming to see them, but because I wanted them. Fresh lilies, sometimes daisies, sometimes roses when I felt bold enough. I trimmed the stems, arranged them in the old glass vase I'd kept tucked away, and placed them where the sunlight could reach them. No bouquets arrived on my porch anymore, and I didn't wait for them. No flowers came, so I bought my own. Their scent filled my rooms, and with every bloom that opened, I felt something opening in me too. My days grew quieter, but not lonely. I read books I had once set aside for later, underlining lines that felt like they belonged to me. I took walks without rushing, noticing the air on my skin, the trees shifting with the seasons. I cooked meals from memory, the kind that made me feel whole, soups that warmed the house, bread that filled it with the smell of comfort. No one complained, no one critiqued. Every bite was mine, every spoonful earned. There was dignity in these small acts, a kind of joy I had never fully known before. All my life I had given, stretched, bent myself into shapes that fit the needs of others. Now I was learning to stand straight, even if I stood alone. I saw my reflection in the mirror one morning, lines deeper, hair thinner, but eyes clear. And for the first time in a long time, I did not see someone forgotten. I saw someone who had endured, someone who had survived not just time, but betrayal, someone who had taken herself back. I understood then that the narrative they wrote for me, the frail mother, the confused old woman, the helpless burden, was never mine to carry. They wrote it to ease their guilt, to justify their choices. I was not the burden. I was the backbone. I was the one who worked, who cleaned, who fed them before I fed myself. And now, in this chapter, I was feeding only me. So I sat at my table, the one they once crowded, the one I once set with trembling hands to make sure everyone else was satisfied. This time, it held only one plate, only one cup, only one presence that mattered. And I felt no sadness in that, only calm, only freedom. This time, I ate at my table, alone and free. It began with one letter. I wasn't sure who I was writing to at first, maybe the air, maybe the silence, but I wrote it anyway. I wrote about the pharmacy, the birthday cake, the account that vanished beneath my feet. I wrote about the room that wasn't mine, the bed that held my tears, the way the world treated me like I was fading when I was sharper than they ever knew. I didn't dress it up. I didn't soften it. I let the truth stand plain on the page. raw and steady. When I finished, I folded it and mailed it to a women's group listed in the back of a small newsletter someone had slipped under my door years ago. I had almost thrown it away, but something told me to send it. A few weeks later, an envelope came back. Inside was not pity, not shock, but recognition. A woman wrote they emptied mine too. Said it was for my safety. I believed them until I couldn't. Another said, my son signed me into a home without asking. He smiled while he did it. Their handwriting was shaky. Some words crossed out, but every line carried a heartbeat that matched my own. Betrayal was not mine alone. It had happened quietly, in kitchens and courtrooms, in hospital rooms and birthday parties. It had been endured by women like me. Strong women made to feel small. More letters followed. Stories came folded in envelopes, sometimes scrawled on scrap paper, sometimes neat and careful, but always brave. They told me of passwords stolen, wills rewritten, rooms locked from the outside. They told me of voices dismissed, of love turned into transactions. And yet, in every story, I saw not just loss but survival. Each woman had endured. Each woman was still standing. We began to trade more than stories. We traded wisdom. One told me how she had moved her money to a credit union her children didn't know about. Another taught me the right questions to ask a doctor so they couldn't brush her aside. We gave each other names of lawyers, recipes that comforted us, scriptures and poems that reminded us we were not erased. There were no marches, no protests, no shouting in the streets. Just quiet fires burning in kitchens, in bedrooms, in the hands of women who refused to be silenced. I started to feel a shift in my chest, something I hadn't felt since before the betrayal. Hope. Not just for myself, but for all of us. I saw how one letter sparked another, how one voice drew out more voices. We were not broken, not fading, not helpless. We were a sisterhood, stitched together by scars, carrying one another in ways our families had failed to. I wasn't alone. I was a spark in a field of quiet fires. And I knew, as long as those fires kept glowing, none of us would ever be truly darkened again. When the dust settled and the voices outside my door finally quieted, I knew there was one more thing I needed to do. Not for them, not even for myself alone, but for the girls and women who might one day walk the same path I had walked. I sat at my desk with the will spread before me, the same document my children had once hovered over like vultures circling. The old words no longer fit. They had been written in a time when I still believed loyalty was unshakable and family was forever. Now I know better. This wasn't about revenge. It was about meaning. I picked up the pen and began to cross out names. My children's lines disappeared one by one, not with anger, but with certainty. They had already taken what they wanted from me and called it love. I would not leave them anymore. Instead, I began to write in new names organizations that fought for women's independence, shelters where women could go when the people closest to them became their captors. I listed charities that provided legal aid, places that gave food to single mothers, programs that offered scholarships to young girls who had no one to believe in them. If my money could do anything, it would not line the pockets of those who betrayed me. It would give wings to those still learning how to stand. But I didn't stop with money. I left words, too. Stacks of letters, handwritten in my own shaky script, sealed in envelopes that would outlive me. Some were addressed to no one, meant only for the eyes of whichever young girls stumbled upon them years from now. Inside, I told the truth. That being old does not mean being useless. That silence does not mean surrender. That giving everything does not mean you must accept being emptied. I wrote of betrayal, yes, but also of resilience, of quiet storms and second chances. I told them what I had learned too late. You do not need to wait for permission to claim your own life. Each letter was a seed. Each envelope, a small lantern against the dark. I imagined some girl opening one long after I was gone, her hands trembling, her eyes widening as she read words she thought no one else had ever felt. I imagined her feeling less alone, stronger, a spark, ready to grow into her own fire. When I finished, I sealed my will with steady hands. For the first time, the paper didn't feel like a sentence hanging over me. It felt like a declaration, a final act of truth. They thought they had erased me, reduced me to a cautionary tale of age and frailty. But in the end, I had written myself back into the story. My story. The house was gone, the bank account safe, the voices of my children silenced by their own choices. What I left behind now was something they could never touch. A legacy not of bitterness, but of clarity. A map for others to follow. Proof that even in the last chapters of a life, a woman could still hold the pen. I sat back in my chair, folded my hands, and let the weight lift. There was no need for anger. No need for revenge dressed in fire. My justice was quieter, stronger, and lasting. They thought they'd write me off. I rewrote the ending.